Okay, there you are. We're back. So am I. All right, as I've pointed out, we're going to take a look at the skull, and the skull is giving us much better accuracy than looking at any single bone, for example, the femur. As I've noted, the skull is producing or has the capability of producing 80 to 90% accuracy, and this always should be used alongside of other anthroposcopic analyses and anthropometrics, but as I pointed out, we're not doing that. So let's take a look at some of the areas that we're concerned about estimating sex on. Okay, so on your WordPress, evidence of the past, what you'll find is a rating sheet. I'll also post this on our Canvas, and this is the sheet that I'm using. Generally, this type of a sheet, anyhow, for the nuchal crest, the mastoid process, or supraorbital margin, the glabella, and the zygomatic extension, and I'll go through this, but there are a number of rating systems that you can see online, but it does help us engage in that comparative approach, and that's really essential when we're engaging in anthroposcopy or even anthropometry. Okay, so let's move along and take a look at some of these features and how they're rated. All right, so looking at bossing, the area that we're interested in is the general dimorphic feature or physical feature that we see with respect to the frontal bone. So if we look at the right hand corner, we see an indication of the area that we're looking at, the frontal bone, and we'll put in a couple of symbols. Here we have our symbol for a female, a circle, a little bit of difficulty there, and a triangle for a male. And we're going to rate this 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So this is the example that we always want to compare our material to, whether or not we're looking at bossing or the glabella or our orbital margin. And what we're seeing here and what's allowing us to rate this is the general feature or the vertical characteristic that we see with the frontal bone. So number one, we see a very vertical line, that eventually progresses backwards as we move superior. And again, we have a little more of a slope here, a number two. And now we're starting to proceed back further. So we're losing that vertical angle from the supraorbital brow ridge. I'll just draw that right in here. So if this is our supraorbital brow ridge and we're moving superior, we're having a change in that ultimate angle from something that's pretty much 90 degrees if we go over to the example number one. Okay, so that's about a 90-degree, very close to it, and then progresses backwards. So we're losing that 90-degree angle. As we move to number 4, we see it progressing back. And number 5, a complete loss of that vertical feature and a sloping forehead. When we see more of a sloping forehead, we're going to categorize that as number 5 or 4, depending upon really its similarity to textbook examples. And then we're going to rate that. And in this particular example, we're going to rate everything out of 30. So that's going to give us a number out of 30. So if I was looking at myself, for example, I think I'm about a 4 to a 5 in around there. We'll take a look at an X-ray of myself in a minute. But for this particular feature, I'd say, well, maybe a bit of 4. We'll confirm that in a minute. And we're going to continue to add that up as we progress along. So let's move over and take a look at another feature and rate it. All right, so here we have the glabella and what we're referring to again. And if we put in our female and we have our male over on the right-hand side, we're going to rate this in the same way. So these are our textbook examples, 1, 2, 3, 4, and of course 5. Now the area that we're referring to, again, it's on the frontal bone. However, it's the area that's just superior to our nasal bone. So if I draw a line there where our nasal bone is, we're looking at this area, really, if you feel it, right in between, just above, superior to your orbits, in between your eyes, right in that area. So you can feel it right now, whether or not one is present. I certainly feel something there. This individual, we really don't have the presence of a glabella. it's quite flat. Now we're seeing a little bit of a protrusion, a little bit of that glabella emerging in number 2. Now it's becoming much more distinct as we move to number 3. Number 4, that's a very obvious glabella. And then, of course, at number 5, it's quite pronounced. And again, we're going to rate this. So if I was referring to myself and we said we were out of, 30 that we're going to be at, and I already had 4, I'm going to say I'm probably 4-ish as well. So now I'm up to 8 out of 30 as I'm progressing through this. And that's going to allow us to make that estimation when we're looking at 30. If we're seeing 15 out of 30, well, that's really indeterminate. However, if we're seeing 20 out of 30 when we do our final calculations, we're going to say, well, in all likelihood, this individual is moving towards masculinized features. Therefore, we're fairly safe to say that we can estimate a male. Okay, so we're in the same area. We're still on the frontal bone here, and we're looking at something we call the orbital margin. So in the right-hand corner, we have an indication of the area that we're looking at, and this is another area that you can feel as well. I remember our forensic anthropology teacher at university saying, you've got a great cheat sheet when you're testing your body. Go ahead and feel these areas and remember those areas. So if you go to the lateral, okay, so your orbit's laterally, okay, so towards your ears, you're moving towards there as far as you can go, right into this, I'll draw this in here, the area that I want you to feel, right about there in red. You can kind of pinch it and see how thick it is, okay, and that's what we're measuring here, the thickness of that orbital margin. In some individuals, and I've given you an example a little bit earlier, if we look at a cup, for example, a wine glass, the rim in a wine glass, it tends to be quite narrow. In contrast, if we look at an old-fashioned mug, Tim Hortons mug, I'll use that. We all like a good Timmy's, unless it's a Starbucks, of course. We have a much wider ridge there. So that's kind of a good way to put this into perspective. That's what we're looking for, is the thickness of that ridge or that margin. Now again, adding in textbook female, textbook male, masculinized. If we look at the female, we have a very thin, narrow margin, and that's number 1. As we progress along, we're starting to see that margin increase. So number 2, a little bit larger. Number 3, that margin's becoming thicker as well as we're progressing towards the masculinized features. Number 4, it's becoming much larger. And number 5, it is quite robust. Introduce a new term there if you haven't heard it. Masculinized features we often call robust, and in contrast, when we look at feminized features, use a term called gracile, which ultimately means soft features, and robust, large. And so large features versus softer types of features. They're nonetheless there. So again, rating this system, I don't know, I think I'm at about a number 4 as well. And like I said, we'll see where we are in the end. We'll take a look at one of my x-rays. So I think I'm pretty much consistently around a number 4. Again, if I'm looking at my charts. Now we come to the zygomatic extension. The zygomatic extension, it is just above the auditory meatus. Okay, so this hole here, a student once famously commented, they said, you mean the ear hole? Yes, I mean the ear hole. Again, moving through female to male, what we're seeing or what we're looking for is this line associated with the zygomatic bone and how far it extends past the auditory meatus. And in this example, it doesn't really move much beyond that auditory meatus, and that is a highly feminized feature. If we move to number 2 that I've identified, now we're seeing it extend slightly. I'm going to highlight it here. There it is, number 2. Number 3, it's progressed much further. Number 4, we're starting to see this become very pronounced and robust. And of course, number 5, we have a very robust feature here. Another highly masculinized feature. So we look at the skull, we look at that zygomatic extension, and we rate it. And again, it's important to understand here when we're doing this arthroscopic analyses, it is interpretive. And that's why we always need to use examples where there is a lot of consensus about what a female or feminized versus masculinized feature looks like. Now, if we move slightly down from that, here I'll highlight it in a different color. I'll put green here. Okay, so there's that zygomatic extension. We're still looking in that same area, the auditory meatus, and now we're looking at the mastoid process. So if you take your index finger and you put it in your ear, not too far in, just at that meatus, and you feel back with your thumb, you will feel your mastoid process. The mastoid process is also rated as highly feminized to masculinized, and we'll also find that this also helps us determine what the ancestry of an individual is as well, because they do tend to have different shapes depending upon where our ancestors came from. So number 1, we are seeing a small mastoid process. Number 2, that mastoid process is becoming larger. Number 3, we see an example of a larger mastoid process. Number 4, it's becoming quite pronounced. And of course, number 5, we have a robust, well-pronounced mastoid process, which is consistent with a male. Right, so if we move to the occipital, move to the occipital bone, and we see in our right-hand corner the area that we're looking at, and I can here draw in perhaps a neck as well. Okay, this is where we see muscle attachment for our neck muscles, and it does attach to the back of the occipital, or the inferior, more inferior aspect of the occipital bone. And again, we can rate this from female to male. Female, we do not see a well-pronounced nuchal crest, or sometimes referred to as an occipital protuberance. Number 2, we're seeing a little bit emerging here. Number 3, again, ever so slightly. Number 4, we do see a little bit of a hook beginning to appear. And number 5, it's become well pronounced. And in some individuals, we see more of a hyper robust type of feature where that occipital bone actually has a hook right on it, something like that. And this will also change over the course of our life depending upon the type of occupation that we're in, or the activities that we engage in. So individuals, you can imagine Arnold Schwarzenegger, he is going to have a very large nuchal crest that has a heck of a lot to do with the amount of muscles that he has built up over the course of his life. So again, we can use that stuff to help build a biological profile. Okay, so what self-respecting anthropologist wouldn't have an X-ray of themselves? No, actually, I think this says a little bit more about the propensity that I have, the inclination that I have to injure myself. And, well, I have a handful of X-rays on hand. Okay, so let's go through this just for fun, because I've never done this, so I'm a little bit excited. Let's look at bossing. We said we want to look at the glabella. We need to look at the orbital margin. I'll just use short form here. In addition to the orbital margin, we're interested in the zygomatic extension. We're interested in the mastoid process. And of course, the nuchal crest. And here I'm working alongside of my scoring sheets. You should be doing that as well. And let's go through this. So bossing. If we were looking at a feminized feature, we'd see this type of dotted line feature where the frontal bone has more of a vertical line rather than the sloping line that we see here on my skull. So I'm going to say that that is about a 4. With respect to the glabella, there it is. Now that I'm seeing it, I originally said 4. I'm going to say it's higher. It's 5. As for the orbital margin, okay, so let's go over to the left-hand side, and I'll show you the area. So this is the area that we're interested in, and it's a little bit hard to see, so it's best for me to kind of feel it with my fingers, and I'm going to say that that margin is a 3. As for the zygomatic extension, okay, so we're going to see this on the right-hand side, a lateral view. There's that ear hole, that auditory meatus, and right in around here, we're seeing an extension. There's no question about that. So as for that zygomatic extension, I'm going to say a 4. The mastoid process, there it is right there. If we go to the anterior view on the right-hand side, there it is right there. And I'm going to say that that mastoid it's pretty large. Okay, I'm going to give it a 5. And finally, the nuchal crest, a little bit difficult for us to see because I don't have a full x-ray here, but if we follow this line, we're seeing kind of a curvature there, right, in that area. So if I erase that, we can see it again. And we have to imagine the way as if we were putting pottery together. We're archaeologists. There is something taking place there, rather than what I'm going to highlight in red here. You know, we can see that there's obvious a line that's taking us in a different way, that we're going to imagine that construction. So as for that nuchal crest, I'm going to say about a 4. Okay, and this is out of obviously 30. Okay, and what do we have here? We have 5, 10, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. First one to calculate wins. And 25, if we divide 25 by 30, that gives us about 83%. So I'm going to say 83% confident estimating male based upon the features that I'm seeing here. Okay, and there's a number of other ones, and they're discussed. For example, the mastoid, the mandible, the ramus there. We're looking at the eminence on our mandible. We're not going to do all of that. We're just going to keep it simple and try to get a rating out of 30. So let's look at another example. All right, so looking at another individual here. Let's run through these. The glabella. Okay, so the glabella right in this region. It's there. It's not really huge. My glabella is much larger. I'm going to say that that is about a 3. As for the bossing, if this individual had highly feminized and was a 1, we'd see this type of vertical line and then progressing backwards in a posterior manner. I don't see that here. What I see is sloping. I'm going to say that's about, just give me a second as fairly confident saying that that's about a 3 as well. Okay, the nuchal crest. So moving to the occipital, I see some good detail here on the side. So we do have the presence of a nuchal crest, and I'm going to say 4.5 just to show you that using point form is all right as well if we want to try to increase that accuracy. Moving down to the mastoid process, okay, highlighting now, drawing over it. That's quite large. I'm going to say it's a 5. The zygomatic extension, so if we find that auditory meatus right there, I'm seeing a large extension. There's no question about that. I'm confident putting a 5 in that space. As for the orbital margin, we can't see it here, but I'm going to tell you it is a 3. Okay, I do have it on a slide. I just want to fill this out, and I'll show you that in a second. So we can do our calculation. So what do we have? We have 10, 14.5, 20.5, 23.5. Somebody check my calculation. 23.5. Is that about right? Yeah. Okay. So 23.5. I'm going to divide that 23. Where are we here? 23.5 divided by 25. Oh, we're at a 30. Sorry, let me correct that. 78%. So I'm again, I'm confident saying that this is in fact a male with a good degree of confidence here. I'm going to be within that 80 to 90 percentile based upon my 23 out of 25. If my score was lower, obviously 15 out of 30, well, that's where we get into that area of question. Now let's just briefly take a look at that orbital margin because I do have it here. Okay, the orbital margin region right in here, okay, right in there, and like I said, that's about a 3. So here, and we do see a good example from this view as well as that glabella. So I'm just going to kind of highlight that area right in around there. Clearly a glabella, and I might even be more confident again reassessing this and saying, okay, you know what, I might want to give it a 0.5 on top of that as well, bringing this up to 24 out of 30. And that's one of the things that we do want to do. We want to come back, we want to reassess, we want to be very confident in our assessment. Okay, so we're going to do one more here for argument's sake to prove a very important point. So if we look at the glabella, we know exactly where that is right now, and it is well pronounced. Give it a 4. As for the bossing, okay, if we had a female, we'd expect a line, vertical line, superior manner, eventually progressing backwards. We don't see that. Okay, what we do see is that sloping feature. So I'm going to place the bossing, I'm going to place this as a 4. Okay, that bossing isn't present. Now, if we go back to that nuchal crest, there's clearly a lot of activity, a lot of detail there. The nuchal crest, I'm going to place at a 4 as well. As for the mastoid process, okay, here we go. There's the mastoid process. That's large. That is a very large mastoid process. I'm placing it at a 4. As for the zygomatic extension, okay, it's extending. The features are robust. It doesn't extend as far back as the last example. I think the last example came back somewhere here, but we are seeing a lot of features here indicating a robust zygomatic extension, so I'm going to say 4 as well. As for the orbital margin, let's take a look at that. All right, sorry, we have some, I'll just erase that stuff. I'll do it quick enough. If we look at the orbital margin, have you found it while I erase? Okay, so if you were looking for it, you're going to say right there. That's quite significant as well. I'm going to place that in around a 3. Okay, so what do we have here? We have 12, 20, 23? We got 12, 8, and 3, so we have 23 out of 30. And let's do a division there, 23 divided by 30. So as for my confidence that it is a male, it's 76% towards those male features, okay? And when we're estimating this way, that's giving us accuracy 80 to approximately 90%. So this really is pointing in the direction of male very clearly. And here we see, we can look at this as well. We see a well-defined, look at that glabella. Okay, it is quite pronounced. We're seeing a lot of detail on this individual. What you will find, and this is where it's important to have this comparative information. This skeletal sample, it comes from a known individual. The known individual is in fact a female. So we're looking at a masculinized female skeleton. So we need, as pointed out, we need to be careful. And eventually we would come to the conclusion that this individual, in all likelihood, was a female, even though we have this male analysis of the skull. So the skull's telling us, oh, as for male features, we're seeing 76% male-like features here, which is allowing us to say with a high degree of confidence that the skull is masculine. When we move to that pelvic region, what we're going to find is features that are consistent with female. And that's going to cause us to reflect upon that. And in some of these cases, the question would be indeterminate. And we can't make a clear conclusion. In this case, we can because we are working with a known. Okay, so that's where we're going to leave it, talking about the skull. The next short lecture, we're going to take a look at that pelvic region, and we're going to look at those features. Again, the sexual dimorphism that allows us to distinguish between a male and a female, or indeterminate. Take care.